November 15, 1944. 0230 hours. 500 miles southeast of Tokyo Bay. The Japanese convoy Maru U-87, consisting of 14 merchant vessels and 6 escort warships, changed course to avoid a reported American submarine contact. Captain Yoshitaka Mura, aboard the flagship Nishin Maru, had received urgent wireless transmissions from Combined Fleet Headquarters warning that enemy submarines were operating in strength along the convoy routes between Japan and the resource areas of Southeast Asia. The convoy had departed Singapore 12 days earlier, carrying 47,000 tons of strategic materials essential to Japan's collapsing war economy. The cargo manifests read like an inventory of imperial desperation: 8,000 tons of crude rubber from Malayan plantations, 12,000 tons of rice from Indochina to feed Japan's increasingly hungry population, 15,000 tons of bauxite ore for aluminum production, 6,000 tons of tin and copper concentrates, and 4 fully loaded tankers carrying 26,000 tons of crude oil from the Dutch East Indies refineries that represented Japan's primary source of petroleum products. Each ship in the convoy carried more than cargo. They carried the hopes of a nation that had gambled everything on the promise that military conquest could secure economic self-sufficiency. The rubber would be converted into tires for military vehicles and seals for aircraft engines. The rice would supplement domestic production that could no longer feed Japan's population without imports. The bauxite would become aluminum for aircraft construction in factories already operating on reduced schedules due to material shortages. The oil would be refined into aviation gasoline for kamikaze pilots and fuel oil for the combined fleet's remaining operational warships. But Captain Mura understood better than most that Japan's merchant marine was fighting a losing battle against an enemy that seemed to strike from nowhere and disappear without trace. In the 18 months since he had assumed command of convoy escort operations, Mura had witnessed the systematic destruction of Japanese shipping that had reduced the merchant fleet from 6 million tons to less than 2 million tons of operational vessels. Ships that had taken years to build were being sunk faster than Japanese shipyards could replace them, despite working at maximum capacity with materials that were increasingly difficult to obtain. The course change that was meant to ensure survival led directly toward USS Trigger, lying submerged and silent 2 miles ahead of the convoy's new route. Commander Roy Benson, peering through the periscope at the approaching formation, could hardly believe what he was seeing. 14 fully loaded cargo ships in a loose formation that stretched across 8 miles of ocean, protected by only 6 escorts that were spaced too far apart to provide effective anti-submarine coverage for such a large convoy. Benson had been tracking Japanese shipping movements for 36 hours since receiving an ultra-intelligence intercept that had revealed convoy Maru U-87's approximate route and timing. The code-breaking operation at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had decrypted Japanese naval communications that provided American submarines with advance warning of convoy departures, routing information, and escort strength. This intelligence advantage allowed submarine commanders to position their boats along shipping lanes where interception was virtually guaranteed, transforming submarine warfare from random hunting to systematic destruction. Trigger had been positioned at the intersection of 2 major shipping routes that converged southeast of Tokyo Bay, an area that Japanese convoy planners called the funnel, because geographic constraints forced most shipping through a relatively narrow corridor that submarines could easily patrol. Benson had been waiting for 18 hours in an area where 3 other American submarines were also operating as part of a coordinated wolf pack designed to intercept and destroy any Japanese convoy attempting to reach the home islands. The tactical coordination that made such operations possible had evolved through painful experience during the first 2 years of the Pacific War, when American submarines operated independently and achieved limited results despite numerous contacts with enemy shipping. Admiral Charles Lockwood, commanding Submarine Force Pacific, had studied German U-boat tactics in the Atlantic and adapted them to Pacific conditions that required coordination across much greater distances, with communication systems that were often unreliable. The Wolfpack formation surrounding convoy Maru U-87 included USS Wahoo under Lieutenant Commander Dudley Morton, operating 15 miles north of Trigger's position. USS Silversides, commanded by Lieutenant Commander John Coy, was stationed 20 miles to the west. USS Drum, under Commander Delbert Williamson, waited along the convoy's probable escape route toward Japanese coastal waters. Each submarine maintained radio silence while tracking the convoy's approach, but all four commanders understood their roles in the coordinated attack that would begin when Trigger made the first contact. Commander Benson calculated the convoy's speed at 11 knots, somewhat faster than the standard convoy speed of 8 knots that had been adopted to accommodate the slowest merchant vessels. This increased speed suggested that convoy Maru U-87 was carrying particularly urgent cargo, probably oil and strategic materials that Japanese industry desperately needed before winter weather made Pacific shipping even more hazardous. The faster speed also indicated that the convoy was trying to minimize exposure time in submarine-infested waters by reaching Japanese ports as quickly as possible. But speed alone could not protect merchant shipping from submarines that possessed superior underwater performance and torpedo weapons that had been dramatically improved since the early war period when defective Mark 14 torpedoes had plagued American submarine operations. By late 1944, American submarines were equipped with reliable electric torpedoes that left no wake to warn target ships of approaching weapons. These torpedoes carried larger warheads than earlier models and featured improved guidance systems that dramatically increased hit probability even at long range. In 12 hours, convoy Maru U-87 would cease to exist. Trigger would fire 6 torpedoes in the initial attack, achieving 4 hits on 3 different merchant vessels. USS Wahoo and USS Silversides would intercept the survivors and conduct systematic destruction of the remaining convoy vessels. USS Drum would complete the convoy's destruction by sinking the remaining tankers before dawn. By sunrise on November 16th, 12 of 14 merchant vessels would rest on the ocean floor, along with 26,000 tons of crude oil, 8,000 tons of rubber, 15,000 tons of rice, and thousands of tons of strategic materials that Japanese industry desperately needed. The convoy escort commander would survive to file a report that began with the words, "The submarine menace has made convoy operations impossible." This was not an isolated incident or an exceptionally successful submarine operation. By November 1944, the systematic destruction of Japanese convoys had become routine for American submarines operating throughout the Pacific. Between December 7, 1941, and August 15, 1945, American submarines would sink 1,314 Japanese merchant vessels, totaling 5.3 million tons of shipping, representing more than half of all Japanese merchant vessels that attempted to transport strategic materials between the home islands and the resource-producing areas of the empire. Of the approximately 3,000 convoy ships that Japan sent to sea during the Pacific War, submarines would destroy nearly 1,500, severing the supply lines that connected Japanese industry with the oil, rubber, metals, and food supplies essential for continued resistance. The remaining vessels would be sunk by aircraft, mines, surface ships, and operational accidents, leaving Japan increasingly isolated from the resources that had enabled rapid industrialization and military expansion during the preceding decades. But the submarine campaign that accomplished the most successful maritime blockade in military history began not with systematic planning or strategic foresight, but with a series of desperate improvisations by submarine commanders who discovered that their peacetime training, their torpedo technology, and their tactical doctrine were completely inadequate for the war they found themselves fighting after Pearl Harbor. But the submarine campaign that strangled Japan's war economy began not with systematic planning or strategic foresight, but with a series of desperate improvisations by submarine commanders who discovered that their peacetime training, Their torpedo technology and their tactical doctrine were inadequate for the war they found themselves fighting. The story of how American submarines evolved from cautious scouts into convoy killers reveals the most successful maritime blockade in military history, achieved by fewer than 200 submarines operating across 70 million square miles of Pacific Ocean. To understand how American submarines accomplished what had never been achieved in naval warfare, you must first understand the Japanese Empire's fundamental vulnerability to seaborne attack and why Japan's merchant marine represented the most critical target in the Pacific War, more important than battleships, aircraft carriers, or any other military objective. Japan in 1941 was a modern industrial nation that had achieved remarkable economic growth through a development strategy that was fundamentally dependent on imported raw materials to sustain both its civilian economy and its expanding military machine. The home islands, consisting of 4 main landmasses with a total area smaller than the state of California, produced virtually no oil, rubber, tin, copper, aluminum, or iron ore. Industrial production required massive imports of coal, steel, chemical feedstocks, and finished materials that could not be obtained domestically despite intensive efforts to develop synthetic alternatives and domestic mining operations. The Japanese economic miracle of the 1920s and 30s had been built on a simple but dangerous foundation: importing raw materials from around the world, processing them in efficient factories using abundant skilled labor, and exporting finished products to markets throughout Asia and beyond. This strategy had transformed Japan from a feudal agricultural society into a major industrial power within 50 years, but it had also created vulnerabilities that would prove fatal when war disrupted the maritime trade routes that carried essential materials to Japanese ports. Even food production, despite intensive agriculture that maximized yields from limited arable land, depended on fertilizer imports and supplemental rice shipments from Korea, Taiwan, and Southeast Asia. The population growth that had accompanied industrialization meant that Japan could no longer feed itself from domestic agricultural production alone. By 1941, Japan was importing approximately 20% of its total food supply, including rice that was the staple of the Japanese diet and protein sources that were essential for maintaining civilian health and worker productivity. The Japanese Empire's strategic planning was based on a calculation that seemed logical to military and civilian leaders who had witnessed the rapid territorial expansion of the preceding decade. Military conquest would secure permanent control of resource-producing areas in Southeast Asia, the Dutch East Indies, and the Western Pacific that contained vast deposits of oil, rubber, metals, and other materials. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere would integrate these resource areas with Japanese industrial capacity, creating an economically self-sufficient bloc that could resist any external pressure or blockade. The conquered territories would provide not only raw materials, but also markets for Japanese manufactured goods, creating a closed economic system that would eliminate dependence on trade with Western nations that had shown increasing hostility to Japanese expansion. The Dutch East Indies alone contained oil reserves that could supply Japan's entire petroleum requirements for decades. Malayan rubber plantations produced more rubber than Japan could consume. Indonesian tin mines and Philippine copper deposits would provide metals for industrial production and military equipment. But this grand strategy contained a fatal flaw that Japanese planners either ignored or failed to appreciate fully because they had never faced a sustained campaign against their merchant marine. Every ton of raw materials, every barrel of oil, every pound of rubber needed to sustain Japan's war effort had to cross thousands of miles of ocean aboard merchant vessels that were inherently vulnerable to submarine attack. The vast distances involved in Pacific operations meant that supply lines stretched across oceanic areas where submarines could operate with minimal risk of detection or effective counterattack by escort vessels that lacked the range and endurance to provide continuous protection. The Japanese merchant marine in 1941 consisted of approximately 6 million tons of shipping distributed among nearly 3,000 vessels, ranging from small coastal freighters to large ocean-going tankers and passenger ships that had been converted for cargo service. This fleet represented the third largest merchant marine in the world, after Britain and the United States, and Japanese shipyards possessed the technical capability to construct additional vessels as needed to support expanded trade with the newly conquered territories. Japanese shipping technology was among the most advanced in the world, with vessels that incorporated innovations in hull design, propulsion systems, and cargo handling equipment that maximized efficiency and reduced operating costs. The standardized ship designs developed during the 1930s had proven highly successful in commercial service, and Japanese shipyards could produce merchant vessels faster and more economically than most of their international competitors. But unlike the Atlantic convoys that operated between Britain and North America, where shipping could rely on air cover from land-based aircraft, escort vessels that could refuel at intermediate ports, and relatively short routes that minimized exposure time, Japanese supply lines stretched across vast expanses of the Pacific, where submarines could operate virtually undetected for weeks at a time. The distance from Singapore to Tokyo was approximately 3,000 miles across ocean areas, where Japanese air cover was sporadic, and where refueling stations for escort vessels were separated by hundreds of miles. Moreover, the resource areas that Japan had conquered were located at the extreme range of effective convoy operations based on available escort vessels and fuel supplies. Round-trip voyages from Japan to the Dutch East Indies required 3 to 4 weeks, depending on weather conditions and convoy speed, during which merchant vessels were vulnerable to submarine attack throughout the journey. Unlike European convoy routes where escort vessels could be concentrated in areas of maximum danger, Pacific convoys required protection across enormous ocean areas, where submarine threats could materialize anywhere along routes that covered thousands of miles. American submarine doctrine in 1941 was completely unprepared to exploit this vulnerability, because pre-war naval planning had emphasized surface fleet operations and had relegated submarines to reconnaissance and limited attacks on enemy warships. The General Board of the Navy had concluded that submarines would play a secondary role in any Pacific war, supporting the battle fleet by gathering intelligence and attacking capital ships when opportunities arose. Commerce raiding against merchant shipping was considered a secondary mission that would be conducted only under specific circumstances defined by international law. Pre-war training exercises had emphasized submerged operations designed to minimize detection by enemy forces while conducting reconnaissance missions or attacking high-value military targets. Submarine commanders had been taught to avoid prolonged surface operations that might expose their vessels to counterattack by enemy aircraft or surface ships. Night surface attacks, which would prove highly effective against merchant convoys, were virtually unknown in American submarine service because peacetime exercises had not included scenarios where submarines would deliberately engage merchant shipping. The technological limitations of American submarines in 1941 compounded the tactical and doctrinal problems that became apparent when war began. Most submarines in the Pacific Fleet were older designs with limited range, modest speed, and relatively small torpedo loads that restricted their effectiveness in extended operations against merchant shipping. The newer fleet submarines that entered service in the late 1930s possessed better performance characteristics, but even these vessels were designed primarily for operations against enemy warships, rather than systematic commerce raiding. Furthermore, American submarines were equipped with Mark 14 torpedoes that proved catastrophically defective. The magnetic exploder frequently malfunctioned, causing premature explosions or failures to detonate. The depth control was incorrectly calibrated, causing torpedoes to run beneath targets. The contact exploder was too delicate and frequently failed when striking targets. These problems were compounded by conservative tactical doctrine emphasizing long-range attacks that reduced hit probability. The London Naval Treaty of 1930 had established prize rules that required submarines to surface, identify themselves, and allow merchant crews to escape before sinking unarmed vessels. These restrictions, designed to prevent the unrestricted submarine warfare that had characterized World War I and had brought the United States into that conflict, effectively prohibited the kind of commerce raiding that could disrupt Japan's extended supply lines. American submarine commanders had been trained to observe these legal restrictions even in wartime, creating hesitation and procedural delays that reduced operational effectiveness. The transformation that would make American submarines the most effective anti-ship weapon in the Pacific began within hours of the Pearl Harbor attack, but the evolution from cautious reconnaissance to systematic commerce destruction would require months of painful experience and technological innovation before submarine operations achieved their full potential against Japanese merchant shipping. The transformation began within hours of the Pearl Harbor attack. At 14:30 hours on December 7, 1941, Admiral Harold Stark, Chief of Naval Operations, sent a message to all Pacific submarine commands that read simply, "Execute unrestricted air and submarine warfare against Japan." This single sentence swept away 2 decades of legal restrictions and tactical constraints, authorizing submarine commanders to sink any Japanese vessel anywhere in the Pacific without warning. But authorization and capability were different things. American submarine commanders quickly discovered that their peacetime training was inadequate for the war they were now expected to fight. The first war patrols launched against Japanese shipping in late December 1941 and early 1942 achieved minimal results, despite numerous contacts with enemy vessels. Submarine skippers filed patrol reports describing torpedo attacks that should have sunk target ships but resulted in no damage whatsoever. Lieutenant Commander Dudley Morton, commanding USS Wahoo, became one of the first submarine commanders to recognize that successful commerce raiding required aggressive tactics. During Wahoo's third war patrol in January 1943, Morton abandoned cautious long-range attacks and began conducting close-range night surface attacks that revolutionized American submarine tactics. Morton demonstrated that submarines could approach enemy convoys on the surface at night, penetrate escort screens, and fire multiple torpedo spreads at point-blank range. His innovations were documented in patrol reports that became required reading throughout the submarine service. Morton's most significant innovation was the development of coordinated attack procedures that allowed submarines to work together against convoy targets without interfering with each other's operations. Traditional submarine doctrine had assumed that submarines would operate independently, but convoy targets often included more ships than a single submarine could effectively engage before escort vessels organized effective counterattacks. Morton pioneered communication procedures and attack coordination that enabled multiple submarines to strike the same convoy simultaneously from different directions. The effectiveness of Morton's innovations became apparent during Wahoo's fourth war patrol in March 1943, when the submarine sank 9 Japanese merchant ships totaling 27,000 tons in a single patrol. This represented more tonnage than most submarines achieved during their entire wartime service, demonstrating the potential effectiveness of aggressive tactics when applied systematically. Morton's success rate exceeded 90% for torpedoes fired at ranges under 1,000 yards, compared to less than 30% for conventional long-range attacks. Lieutenant Commander Richard O'Kane, who served as Morton's executive officer during these groundbreaking patrols, documented the tactical evolution that transformed Wahoo from a conventionally operated submarine into the most effective commerce raider in the Pacific Fleet. O'Kane's detailed notes recorded not only the mechanics of successful attacks, but also the psychological factors that enabled aggressive operations under combat conditions that would have paralyzed commanders trained in peacetime doctrine. The key psychological breakthrough involved overcoming the defensive mindset that had dominated submarine operations since the service's inception. Traditional submarine commanders thought of their vessels as fragile platforms that required protection from enemy detection and counterattack. Morton and his contemporaries learned to think of submarines as offensive weapons that achieved maximum effectiveness when operated aggressively, despite increased risk to the attacking vessel. This psychological transformation was supported by technological improvements that gradually solved the torpedo problems that had plagued early war patrols. By mid-1943, intensive testing and combat experience had identified the primary causes of Mark 14 torpedo failures. The defective magnetic influence exploder was deactivated entirely, forcing torpedoes to rely on contact detonation that proved much more reliable under combat conditions. Depth control problems were corrected through systematic calibration that accounted for the different water density conditions encountered in Pacific operations. Perhaps most importantly, new contact exploders were developed that functioned properly even when torpedoes struck targets at acute angles or encountered heavily armored hulls. These improved exploders increased the probability of successful detonation from approximately 60% to more than 90%, transforming submarine attacks from exercises in frustration into reliable ship-killing operations. The combination of aggressive tactics and reliable weapons created opportunities for coordinated operations that maximized the effectiveness of the relatively small number of submarines available for Pacific operations. Admiral Charles Lockwood, commanding Submarine Force Pacific from his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, established a systematic program for sharing tactical information among submarine commanders and developing coordinated attack procedures that could be applied throughout the submarine service. Lockwood's innovation involved creating wolf-pack formations that allowed multiple submarines to attack the same convoy simultaneously while maintaining coordination that prevented interference between attacking vessels. Unlike German wolf-pack operations in the Atlantic, which relied on radio communication that could be intercepted by enemy direction-finding equipment, Pacific wolfpacks used predetermined attack positions and timing that minimized communication requirements while ensuring coordination between participating submarines. The development of effective wolfpack tactics required solving communication and coordination challenges that were unique to Pacific operations. The vast distances involved meant that submarines often operated hundreds of miles from their nearest teammates, making direct communication difficult and potentially dangerous if radio transmissions revealed submarine positions to Japanese monitoring stations. Pacific wolfpacks had to operate with much greater independence than their Atlantic counterparts, while still achieving the coordination necessary for effective convoy attacks. The solution involved detailed pre-patrol planning that assigned specific roles and attack positions to each submarine in the wolfpack formation. Primary attack submarines would engage convoy targets first, drawing escort attention and creating confusion that secondary attack submarines could exploit. Blocking submarines would position themselves along probable escape routes to intercept merchant ships that survived the initial attack. Coordination submarines would maintain communication with headquarters and provide tactical intelligence that improved overall pack effectiveness. These coordinated operations achieved results that exceeded the sum of individual submarine capabilities. Wolf pack attacks during late 1943 and early 1944 routinely destroyed entire convoys, eliminating not only the merchant ships but also their cargoes of strategic materials and the experienced crews needed to operate Japan's dwindling merchant fleet. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese merchant seamen was equally significant, as convoy service became synonymous with death sentences that few sailors could survive multiple times. Captain Tamichi Hara, one of Japan's most experienced destroyer commanders, later wrote about the evolution of American submarine tactics that made convoy escort duty a nightmare of perpetual tension, interrupted by moments of absolute terror. Japanese escort vessels found themselves facing enemies that had learned to exploit every weakness in convoy defense, while constantly developing new attack methods that rendered existing countermeasures obsolete. The Japanese response to improved American submarine tactics involved desperate measures that demonstrated the effectiveness of the submarine campaign while revealing Japan's inability to develop adequate countermeasures. Convoy routes were changed frequently to prevent submarines from predicting shipping movements, but route changes also increased voyage times and fuel consumption while reducing the efficiency of the transportation system that Japan desperately needed to maintain. Escort strength was increased by assigning additional destroyers and coastal defense vessels to convoy protection, but these assignments reduced the number of warships available for fleet operations and training, while failing to provide adequate protection against coordinated submarine attacks. Japanese escort vessels lacked the speed to pursue surfaced submarines and the sonar equipment to track submerged targets effectively, making them largely ineffective against the tactics that American submarines had developed. Anti-submarine aircraft were assigned to convoy protection when possible, but Japanese naval aviation was increasingly committed to combat operations that left few aircraft available for escort duty. Moreover, the ranges involved in Pacific convoy operations exceeded the capabilities of most Japanese aircraft, limiting air cover to areas near Japanese bases, while leaving most convoy routes unprotected against submarine attack. The most ambitious Japanese countermeasure involved construction of additional escort vessels, specifically designed for anti-submarine warfare, including the Kaiboken-class coastal defense ships, and converted merchant vessels armed with depth charges and anti-submarine weapons. But these vessels were produced too late and in too few numbers to affect the outcome of the submarine campaign, while their construction diverted resources from production of combat vessels that Japan needed more urgently. By mid-1944, American submarine operations had evolved into a systematic campaign designed to destroy specific categories of Japanese shipping, while disrupting the entire transportation network that connected Japan with its overseas empire. Oil tankers became priority targets because fuel shortages would cripple both Japanese industry and military operations more quickly than shortages of any other material. Cargo ships carrying strategic metals received secondary priority because aluminum, copper, and steel shortages would eventually halt aircraft and weapons production. Food ships carrying rice and other essential supplies were targeted not only for their military significance, but also for their impact on civilian morale and Japan's ability to maintain industrial production with an increasingly malnourished workforce. Transport ships carrying military equipment and personnel were attacked both for their immediate tactical value and for their contribution to Japan's inability to reinforce threatened territories or conduct effective counteroffensives. Admiral Charles Lockwood, commanding Submarine Force Pacific from his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, established a systematic program for sharing tactical information among submarine commanders. Successful patrol reports were analyzed for innovative techniques that could be adopted throughout the submarine service. Commanders who developed effective new tactics were rotated to shore duty, where they could train other skippers in combat-proven methods. By late 1943, American submarine operations had evolved from individual hunting to coordinated campaigns designed to disrupt specific shipping routes and destroy entire convoys. The impact on Japanese shipping became apparent in the convoy loss statistics that Imperial Navy headquarters tracked with growing alarm. During 1942, American submarines sank approximately 600,000 tons of Japanese merchant shipping. In 1943, this figure doubled to 1.2 million tons. By 1944, submarine attacks were destroying Japanese shipping faster than Japanese shipyards could replace lost vessels. But the effectiveness of the submarine campaign cannot be measured solely in tonnage sunk. Every merchant vessel lost to submarine attack represented not only the ship itself, but also its cargo of strategic materials essential to Japanese war production. A 10,000-ton tanker sunk between Borneo and Japan not only eliminated the vessel, but also prevented delivery of the crude oil it carried, oil that might have been converted into aviation gasoline for kamikaze attacks or fuel oil for naval operations. The psychological impact on Japanese merchant crews was equally significant. Sailing between Japan and the resource areas became a death sentence that merchant sailors accepted with fatalistic resignation. Merchant vessels began sailing in convoys that offered some protection through concentrated escort coverage, but convoy formation also created target-rich environments that allowed submarines to sink multiple ships in single attacks. The convoy system that Japan adopted in late 1942 was modeled on British practice in the Atlantic, but Pacific conditions made effective convoy operations much more difficult than in European waters. The distances involved were enormous. The convoy route from Singapore to Tokyo covered approximately 3,000 miles across ocean areas where Japanese air cover was sporadic or non-existent. Escort vessels were in short supply because Japanese naval construction had emphasized battleships and aircraft carriers over the destroyers, and corvettes needed for convoy protection. Moreover, Japanese anti-submarine warfare technology lagged significantly behind American submarine capabilities. Japanese sonar equipment was inferior to American systems, making submarine detection difficult even under optimal conditions. Japanese depth charges were less effective than those used by British and American forces. Japanese escort vessels lacked the speed and maneuverability needed to pursue surfaced submarines that could outrun most convoy escorts. The combination of aggressive American submarine tactics, improved torpedo technology, and weak Japanese defensive capabilities created a strategic disaster for Japan's war economy that became apparent by mid-1944. Industrial production began declining due to raw material shortages. Aluminum production dropped by 60% due to lack of imported bauxite. Steel production was curtailed by shortage of iron ore and coking coal. Aircraft production suffered from lack of aluminum and specialty metals. Even food rationing became necessary, as rice imports from Southeast Asia were disrupted by submarine attacks on merchant shipping. The Japanese response to the submarine threat involved a series of desperate measures that proved inadequate to restore shipping security. Convoy schedules were randomized to prevent submarines from predicting shipping movements. Routes were changed frequently to avoid areas where submarine attacks had occurred. Merchant vessels were armed with defensive weapons and instructed to fight back against surfaced submarines. None of these measures significantly reduced shipping losses because American submarines had evolved beyond the tactics these countermeasures were designed to defeat. The most ambitious Japanese countermeasure was the construction of additional escort vessels specifically designed for anti-submarine warfare. The Kaiboken-class coastal defense ships, displacing approximately 900 tons and armed with depth charges and anti-submarine weapons, were produced in large numbers during 1943 and 1944. But these vessels were too slow to catch surfaced submarines and too few in number to provide adequate protection for the hundreds of convoys sailing between Japan and the resource areas. Captain Tamechi Hara, one of Japan's most experienced destroyer commanders, later wrote that convoy escort duty had become a nightmare of perpetual tension, broken by moments of absolute terror. Escort vessels were constantly searching for submarines that might be lurking anywhere along convoy routes. Contact reports led to depth charge attacks that rarely resulted in confirmed submarine kills. Meanwhile, convoy speeds had to be reduced to accommodate the slowest merchant vessels, making the entire formation more vulnerable to sustained submarine attack. The statistical evidence of American submarine effectiveness became overwhelming by 1944. During the first 6 months of that year, submarines sank more than 600 Japanese merchant vessels totaling over 2 million tons of shipping. The rate of destruction exceeded Japanese shipbuilding capacity by a factor of 5 to 1. Japan was literally running out of ships faster than new vessels could be launched to replace those lost to submarine action. Individual submarine patrols during this period achieved results that would have been considered impossible based on pre-war expectations. USS Tang, commanded by Richard O'Kane, sank 33 Japanese ships totaling 100,000 tons during 5 war patrols. USS Silverside sank 23 ships totaling 90,000 tons. USS Drum accounted for 20 ships totaling 80,000 tons. These 3 submarines alone destroyed more Japanese shipping than the entire German U-boat force accomplished during some months of the Atlantic Campaign. The convoy battles of late 1944 demonstrated the complete collapse of Japan's ability to protect merchant shipping. The high convoy series became particular targets for coordinated submarine attacks. High 71 was completely destroyed by submarines. High 72 lost 8 of 10 ships. The destruction of High 81 in November 1944 represented the pinnacle of American submarine effectiveness, with USS Sealion, USS Spadefish, and USS Salmon destroying every merchant vessel in the formation. But the most strategically significant submarine operation of 1944 was the systematic destruction of Japanese tanker shipping that carried oil from the Dutch East Indies to Japan. Oil was Japan's most critical strategic weakness, and the tanker fleet represented the most valuable segment of Japanese merchant shipping. American submarines specifically targeted tankers, recognizing that fuel shortages would cripple both Japanese industry and military operations more quickly than shortages of any other material. The oil supply situation became critical for Japan by early 1945. Domestic oil production was negligible. The refineries in the Dutch East Indies remained under Japanese control, but transporting crude oil to Japan required tanker shipping that was being systematically destroyed by submarine attack. Storage facilities in Japan held approximately 6 months' supply of petroleum products at normal consumption rates, but military operations were consuming fuel faster than normal, while tanker losses prevented replenishment of reserves. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, one of Japan's most capable naval strategists, later wrote that the submarine campaign against Japanese shipping had accomplished what no other military action could achieve. American submarines had severed the economic arteries that connected Japan with the resources essential to continue the war. By the spring of 1945, Japan was rapidly becoming incapable of sustaining major military operations due to fuel shortages, raw material deficiencies, and the collapse of the transportation system that connected the home islands with the empire's resource-producing areas. The human cost of the submarine campaign extended far beyond military casualties to include the merchant seamen who manned the vessels that submarines targeted. Japanese merchant marine personnel experienced casualty rates that exceeded those of any other service during the Pacific War. Merchant vessels had limited defensive capabilities and minimal protection against torpedo attack. When ships were sunk, survival often depended on location, weather conditions, and the availability of rescue vessels that were themselves vulnerable to submarine attack. The psychological warfare aspect of the submarine campaign was equally significant. Japanese merchant crews knew that every voyage might be their last, but economic necessity and military orders compelled them to continue sailing, despite casualty rates that approached 50% on some routes. The constant threat of submarine attack created stress and fatigue that degraded crew performance, while making merchant service increasingly difficult to maintain, as experienced seamen were killed or refused to continue sailing. American submarine commanders generally attempted to minimize civilian casualties by allowing merchant crews to abandon ship before sinking vessels, but the exigencies of combat and the presence of military escorts often made rescue operations impossible. Submarines operating in enemy-controlled waters could not remain surfaced long enough to conduct extensive rescue operations without exposing themselves to counterattack by aircraft or surface vessels. The strategic impact of the submarine campaign became apparent in Japanese industrial statistics that documented the collapse of war production during the final year of the Pacific War. Steel production dropped to less than 50% of peak levels due to lack of raw materials. Aircraft production declined sharply as aluminum and specialty metals became unavailable. Synthetic fuel production, critical for aviation gasoline, was severely curtailed by shortages of chemical feedstocks that had to be imported from Southeast Asia. Perhaps most significantly, Japanese naval operations were increasingly constrained by fuel shortages that forced cancellation of major operations and reduced training flights for naval aviators. The combined fleet, once the most powerful naval force in the Pacific, was largely immobilized by lack of fuel oil that submarines had prevented from reaching Japanese ports. This fuel shortage directly contributed to the tactical failures that characterized Japanese naval operations during the final year of the war, as inexperienced pilots and inadequately trained crews attempted to conduct complex operations with insufficient preparation. The technological evolution of American submarine warfare during the Pacific War paralleled the tactical innovations that made convoy destruction possible. Submarine construction programs produced larger, faster boats with greater range and more powerful weapons systems. The Balao-class submarines that entered service in 1943 displaced over 2,000 tons submerged and could remain at sea for extended patrols that covered thousands of miles. These submarines carried 24 torpedoes and possessed the speed to intercept fast convoys while maintaining the endurance to conduct prolonged campaigns in distant waters. Radar technology transformed submarine operations by allowing night surface attacks that maximized the advantages of surface speed and maneuverability while minimizing the risks associated with submerged operations. Submarine radar could detect surface contacts at ranges exceeding 20 miles, providing early warning of convoy approach and allowing tactical positioning that was impossible using periscope observation alone. Surface search radar also improved navigation accuracy and helped submarines avoid enemy patrol vessels while approaching convoy targets. Communications technology enabled coordination between submarines that made wolfpack operations possible across the vast distances of the Pacific. High-frequency radio equipment allowed submarines to maintain contact with headquarters and with each other despite operating thousands of miles from base. Secure communication codes prevented Japanese forces from intercepting and decoding American submarine transmissions that might reveal operational plans or submarine positions. The intelligence support that guided American submarine operations was equally important to the campaign's success. Code-breaking operations provided advance warning of convoy movements, allowing submarines to position themselves along shipping routes where interception was most likely. Traffic analysis revealed patterns in Japanese shipping operations that submarines could exploit. Photographic reconnaissance provided detailed information about port facilities and shipping concentrations that helped plan submarine attacks. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, later characterized the submarine campaign as the most cost-effective military operation of the Pacific War. Fewer than 200 submarines, manned by approximately 16,000 officers and enlisted men, had achieved strategic results that would have required massive surface and air operations involving hundreds of thousands of personnel. The submarine force represented less than 2% of total Navy personnel, but accounted for more than 50% of all Japanese merchant shipping destroyed during the war. The economic analysis of submarine effectiveness reveals the extraordinary return on investment that submarine operations provided. The cost of building and operating the American submarine force during the Pacific War was approximately $2 billion. The value of Japanese shipping destroyed by submarine action exceeded $8 billion at replacement cost, not including the strategic value of cargoes that were prevented from reaching Japanese ports. Moreover, the industrial capacity required to replace lost shipping diverted resources from production of military equipment that Japan desperately needed for continued resistance. But the most significant impact of the submarine campaign was its contribution to ending the Pacific War without the costly invasion of Japan that military planners had expected would be necessary. By the summer of 1945, Japan's economy was collapsing due to shipping losses that had severed the supply lines connecting the home islands with essential resources. Industrial production was declining rapidly. Military operations were increasingly constrained by fuel and material shortages. The submarine blockade had created conditions that made continued resistance economically and militarily impossible. Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement on August 15, 1945, cited the submarine blockade as one of the factors that compelled Japan's capitulation. The empire that had begun the Pacific War with ambitious plans for economic self-sufficiency had been reduced to near starvation by the systematic destruction of the merchant marine that carried the resources essential for survival. American submarines had achieved what siege warfare had accomplished throughout military history, forcing surrender through economic strangulation rather than military conquest. The legacy of the Pacific submarine campaign extends beyond its immediate impact on World War II to influence naval strategy and submarine development throughout the Cold War and into the modern era. The demonstration that submarines could achieve strategic results through commerce raiding validated submarine warfare as a decisive military capability that continues to shape naval planning and force structure decisions. Modern submarine forces trace their tactical doctrine and operational concepts directly to innovations developed during the Pacific War campaign against Japanese shipping. The moral and legal questions raised by unrestricted submarine warfare continue to influence international law and military ethics. The decision to abandon prize rules and conduct unrestricted attacks on merchant shipping represented a fundamental change in the conduct of naval warfare that established precedents for modern conflicts. The civilian casualties that resulted from submarine attacks on merchant vessels highlighted the difficulty of distinguishing between military and civilian targets in total war conditions. 79 years after the last American submarine returned from patrol in the Pacific, the strategic principles demonstrated during the campaign against Japanese shipping remain relevant to contemporary naval operations. The ability of submarines to disrupt enemy supply lines, the effectiveness of coordinated attacks against convoy shipping, and the strategic impact of economic warfare conducted by relatively small forces continue to influence military planning and submarine deployment patterns. The 3,000 convoy ships that Japan sent to sea during the Pacific War represented more than just transportation capability. They carried the hopes and resources of an empire that believed economic self-sufficiency could provide security against external pressure. The systematic destruction of half this shipping by American submarines demonstrated the vulnerability of extended supply lines and the strategic power of forces that could operate undetected across vast ocean areas. The submarine commanders and crews who conducted this campaign achieved results that exceeded every pre-war prediction about submarine effectiveness. They transformed American submarines from cautious scouts into convoy killers through tactical innovation, technological improvement, and sustained operations under combat conditions that tested both equipment and personnel to their limits. Their success in severing Japan's maritime lifelines contributed directly to ending the most destructive war in human history, while establishing submarine warfare as a dominant factor in naval strategy. That is how American submarines strangled Japan's war economy by sinking half the convoy ships that carried the resources essential for continued resistance, demonstrating that control of sea lanes could achieve strategic victory through economic pressure rather than military conquest, and establishing the precedent for submarine operations that continues to influence naval warfare 8 decades after the last torpedo was fired in anger across the Pacific Ocean.